Japan entered the 20th century in a period of transition. A country which had isolated itself from the outside world was being reborn as a leading world power. It was opening to the world and hastened to catch up with its backlog in all the most important spheres of industry, such as shipbuilding, aviation, and engineering. Foreign specialists were invited to train Japanese engineers, and the Japanese themselves started traveling and studying technical novelties. Over several decades, Japan managed to catch up with its backlog in the technical aspect almost from scratch, and to realize itself as a power which should dominate implicitly in the region. As it started to gain power, Japan turned its attention to its neighbors, aiming at expanding its areas of influence and its territories. Thus, in 1879, the Ryukyu state located on Okinawa Island was annexed, and in 1894, Japan fought a war with China, as a result of which Japan gained the island of Taiwan. Another war over redivision of areas of influence was fought between Japan and Russia in 1904 and 1905, the main result of which was the final annexation of Korea to Japan in 1910. All those wars won at the turn of the century built up the glory of the Japanese army and navy, as well as strengthening the faith of the Japanese in their unconquerable armed forces, and their confidence that Japan should become the largest state in Asia. In 1922, Japan was the first country in the world to launch a ship whose class was strictly determined as aircraft carrier. Shortly after that, aircraft carriers initially built as battleships went into service. All these facts demonstrate the importance of specifically naval aircraft in Japan. As both the Army and Navy possessed their own aircraft in Japan, both of them developed its aircraft quite separately. In fact, these two military forces were completely independent of each other and sometimes had utterly different views on conducting military operations and the location of those actions as well. In 1937, a new war with China began when Japan established control over the northern and central parts of the territory. In response to the war in China and the movement of troops into French Indochina, the USA placed an embargo on oil and metal supply to Japan. These materials were vital for the conduct of military operations, so Japan had to seek out another source. It was quickly found in European colonies in Southeast Asia, which automatically made them the object of military invasion. After the introduction of the embargo, the Japanese headquarters became more and more conscious that conflict with the USA and England was inevitable if the country continued its expansion southwards. And consequently, plans for a preemptive strike began to emerge. One of the possible plans even provided for striking an aircraft carrier blow on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base located on the Oahu island of Hawaii. However, these plans would only be implemented if peace talks failed and Japan did not succeed in convincing America in the rightness of her position. On April 10, 1941, Japan established the first aircraft carrier fleet comprising 3 divisions of 2 aircraft carriers each. It was the first large formation of aircraft carriers in the world. And on November 16, 1941, 1 century after American military forces put an end to the isolation of Japan, the Japanese First Air Fleet, including 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, left their ports and headed to Hawaii.
On December 2, Japanese fleet received a telegram telling to open a top-secret envelope, the contents of which told that the Japanese Empire had decided to go to war against the United States, Britain, and Holland. On December 7th, at 0530 hours, the Japanese task force turned northeast, and Akagi signaled the aircraft of the first wave to prepare for takeoff at 0615. Wheeler Field and other fields were primary targets in the Japanese attack plan. Battleships were chosen as the main targets in the U.S. fleet, since they were the prestige ships of any navy at the time.
I see about 8 battleships and no aircraft carrier. It's like practice. Torpedo bombers attack. Target is hit.
The second wave was divided into 3 groups. One was tasked to attack Kaneohe flying boats, and the rest were to attack Pearl Harbor. Japanese pilots had maps to orient themselves above the Pearl Harbor naval base. The second wave consisted of 171 planes, 54 B-5N5s, 81 D-3A1s, and 36 A-6M2s.
The first wave was successful. We must confirm our success. We've got to continue attacking ships. The whole harbor is on fire! Attack the flying boat base!
Operations room, expecting to hear reconnaissance reports from the Tone and Chikuma seaplanes, which had been dispatched about 30 minutes before. The first report from the Chikuma's plane came in. It read, "The enemy fleet is not in Lahaina anchorage. The enemy fleet is in Pearl Harbor." How pleased we were to receive this report. Instinctively, Admiral Nagumo and all of his staff officers looked at each other and could not suppress their smiles. The only thing remaining was to await the results of the attack. Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff, 1st Air Fleet.
Japanese forces estimated results of the attack on Pearl Harbor to be phenomenal. They achieved complete surprise, and according to pilots' reports, several ships and a large number of aircraft were destroyed. American forces in the Pacific suffered shattering losses. Several battleships, the pride of both sides' navies, were destroyed. Japan implemented an unprecedentedly bold plan. 6 aircraft carriers came almost close to the naval base of the enemy, attacked it suddenly, and achieved complete success in their attack. It was the real triumph for the Japanese Navy. Besides success in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces managed to occupy a small island of Wake, which was located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and had a runway defended by a small marine garrison. Though not without losses among warships, the island's defense was overwhelmed and the landing troops freely landed on its territory. In January 1942, Japan landed its forces in Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and Solomon Islands. On February the 15th, it surrounded 130,000 soldiers during the Battle of Singapore. and in May, the rest of American and English forces yielded themselves in the Philippines. Occupation of all these territories was stipulated by the general plan before the beginning of the war. Therefore, all subsequent military actions were conducted by Japan in accordance with new plans which were developed after the beginning of the war. Inspired by success of the first months of war, the Japanese considered that they could act on the offensive in utterly different divisions simultaneously. And then the Japanese needed to seize Port Moresby, the major stronghold of the Allies, which was both the way to Australia and the last bulwark of the Allies in the region. The plans also included occupation of the Tulagi Island, aimed at establishing a float seaplane base there. Japan established several formations for the operation, so each of them could act promptly and independently of others. This tactic, as they believed, allowed them to fulfill several tasks simultaneously. The 5th Aircraft Carrier Division was assigned for the operation. It comprised Zuikaku and Shokaku aircraft carriers, which were to protect the landing force by the aircraft.
On May 7, 1942, a massive attack launched from American carriers Lexington and Yorktown destroyed light carrier Shoho, the leader of a group of ships heading towards Port Moresby. When Shoho was destroyed, the remaining ships from the group turned north. The ships heading towards Port Moresby were also forced to retreat. Lexington and Yorktown continued their search for the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, sailed around the Solomon Islands and headed towards Port Moresby. On the morning of May 8, the Americans detected the Japanese fleet and launched an airstrike from both carriers.
Zauważono wroga. Zbliżam się do celu. Great job. Looks like Shokaku hasn't been damaged. There is another group following them. Roger that. Seeker fighters, move towards the second group and attack. Roger that. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Carrier, believed to be the Zuikaku class, was observed by all pilots to burn fiercely in a manner obviously beyond control. Several severe explosions other than those resulting from bomb or torpedo hits were observed. And before the attack was completed, the ship was almost entirely hidden by smoke and flame. The smoke cleared before all the Lexington planes left the area, and the ship had disappeared. Report of Air Operations Officer, USS Lexington. While Japanese fighters were defending Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japanese bombers were approaching the Lexington and Yorktown.
Approaching designated coordinates. Maintain vigilance. Yes, sir. Zbliżam się do celu. Fighters, attention! Attack enemy planes! I repeat, attack enemy planes! Don't let them come near the bombers or torpedo bombers that are attacking the ships! Roger that. Attack! It's shredded! Mission accomplished! Wing head back! Returning to Shokaku.
Amidst this fantastic rainfall of anti-aircraft and spinning planes, I dove almost to the water surface and sent my torpedo into the Saratoga-type carrier. I had to fly directly above the waves to escape the enemy's shells and tracers. In fact, when I turned away from the carrier, I was so low that I almost struck the bow of the ship, for I was flying below the level of the flight deck. I could see the crewmen on the ship staring at my plane as it rushed by. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, IJN Zuikaku.
The Battle of the Coral Sea became the first serious test for the Japanese aircraft carrier navy, as it was the case when Japanese aircraft carriers met American ones. And the Japanese undoubtedly called this battle their victory. They considered 2 aircraft carriers of the enemy to be probably destroyed. However, after the attack, the covering forces had 2 little planes left, so they had to postpone the landing on Port Moresby itself for an uncertain period of time. However, Tulagi Island was occupied, which strengthened the position of the Japanese on the Solomon Islands. The seizure of Port Moresby was considered an army operation, and the Navy was preparing another operation at the same time aimed at luring and destroying the rest of the American aircraft carriers. Now, after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Americans were likely to have fewer aircraft carriers left, which made fulfillment of this task easier. Seizure of a military base on the Midway Atol was to become a bait for the Americans. The Japanese reckoned that the enemy could not allow the loss of this strategic point and would surely answer the challenge, where there would be an armada of aircraft carriers and battleships waiting for the enemy. At the same time, the Navy was conducting an operation of landing on the Aleutian Islands, which were to become another pivot in the war against the Allies, which Japan was waging on many fronts simultaneously. In early June 1942, a huge Japanese fleet comprising over 70 ships and 4 aircraft carriers, Hiryu, Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, moved out towards the Midway Atol.
4 June. End day -3 for Operation MI. Japanese naval operation for occupation of Midway Island. Military base at the end of the Hawaiian island chain. A vital outpost for the U.S. naval forces. First Carrier Striking Force and Midway Invasion Force approximately 300 miles out, approaching Midway from the northeast and the southeast. Early morning that day, 1st Carrier Striking Force under the command of Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi begins the first phase of operation. Airstrike on Midway Atoll Base.
Take a course on Midway. Keep the formation. Let's proceed Pearl Harbor! Hold above formation of bombers. Be ready to intercept the enemy fighters. Zbliżam się do celu. Destroyed weapon caches on the island, but the runway was not damaged. We need to attack again.
I saw the bombs released over Sand Island, and then had to hug the ground as 6 planes released their bombs over the eastern island, and they landed close to my position. The dive bombers came out of the sun a few minutes later. They appeared to be Aichi 99s. The Zeros came in strafing immediately afterward. I saw 2 Brewsters trying to fight the Zeros. One was shot down and the other was saved by ground fire covering his tail. Both looked like they were tied to a string while the Zeros made passes at them. Statement of 2nd Lieutenant Charles S. Hughes, USMCR, June 4, 1942. Still unaware of the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers, the Japanese fleet was preparing a second attack on Midway. 9 fighters from Kaga provided the fleet with air support. Their number was increased after a B-17 attack, originating from Midway. The Japanese launched the fighters that were supposed to cover the bombers during the second attack on the island.
We won't be able to catch up with them. far your planes were those? They look like T-17 from Midway. You think there will be other attacks? I think so. Otherwise, they wouldn't have ordered us to take off. I see a group of enemy bombers to the south at 6,500 feet. Now, it's our turn. Moving into intercept. Zauważona wroga. Zbliżam się do celu. Another group approaching at 5,000 feet from the south. And 5,000 feet. There are too many of them. They can't all be from Midway.
Preparations for a counter-strike against the enemy had continued on board our 4 carriers throughout the enemy torpedo attacks. One after another, planes were hoisted from the hangar and quickly arranged on the flight deck. There was no time to lose. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch when ready. On Akagi's flight deck, all planes were in position, with engines warming up. The big ship began to turn into the wind. Within 5 minutes, all the planes would be launched. 5 minutes. Who would have dreamed that the tide of battle would shift completely in that brief interval of time? Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, IJN Akagi. While the cover fighters were fighting American planes southeast of the fleet, the last wave of bombers was approaching from the west, undetected. Met with no opposition, American bombers were able to drop bombs on 3 carriers. After the U.S. attack, Rear Admiral Abe Hiroki, who took command of the fleet after Akagi was sunk, had 1 aircraft carrier left at his disposal. Hiroki ordered a counterstrike against the U.S. fleet. The first wave of Japanese dive bombers set one of the enemy aircraft carriers ablaze. Yamaguchi, commander of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, already knew that the U.S. fleet consisted of 3 aircraft carriers. He decided to launch a second strike. Raid leader Lieutenant Tomonoga obeyed without hesitation, although it was a one-way ticket for him. He knew that his airplane would not make it back. His fuel tank was damaged in the attack on Midway earlier that morning.
Our first attack left one of the American carriers ablaze. Our mission is to find and destroy the rest. American fleet in sight! I don't see any damaged carriers. Looks like we found the second American fleet. Launch the attack. Didn't make it. I saw his plane falling on the carrier flight deck. He damaged his fuel tank during the Midway attack earlier this morning. He knew it was his last flight.
The first torpedo appeared to pass under the Hammond in the vicinity of gun number 2 and exploded against the side of the Yorktown. The second torpedo struck the Hammond in fire room number 2. This torpedo apparently broke the ship's back, as a pronounced sag was noted in this vicinity. Large quantities of oil, water, and debris were blown high into the air, coming down on both the Hammond and Yorktown. Commander Arnold Ellsworth True, USS Hammond. All power was lost, steam dropping immediately, and electric power failed completely. The rudder was jammed at about 15 degrees left, and the ship became dead in the water. USS Yorktown, report of action for June 4, 1942.
The Battle of Midway did not appear a complete defeat for the Americans, but it did destroy all the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, including Hiryu. During the battle, the Japanese repelled all the first attacks, but only the 2 last attacks turned out to be decisive for the battle. The Japanese tactics of conducting operations fell short, and now the Japanese had to reconsider it. However, Japan had successfully landed on the Aleutian Islands, and it was time now to fortify the positions on the occupied territories by turning them not only into fortresses, but also into big airfield junctions. Besides, after the battle, several American aircraft carriers were also damaged, so the Americans suffered great losses, which demonstrated to the Japanese that the enemy would not be able to act on the offensive actively for some time. An airfield under construction on the Guadalcanal Island was to become one of the bases which would allow the Japanese to consolidate firmly their positions on the Solomon Islands. However, the Americans learnt of that construction and landed troops on the island. They seized the airfield without a blow and commenced proceeding with its building up. The Japanese could not conceive that the Americans could fortify their position there, so the army landing troops were supposed to throw them back to the sea without any problem. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they underestimated the enemy forces and failed to dislodge the enemy by their first attacks. The battles on Guadalcanal and around the island grew into a prolonged military campaign.
August 7, 1942. American troops land on Tulagi and Guadalcanal Islands, aiming to overtake them. Caught off balance, Japanese forces were unable to hold their positions. Guadalcanal was taken. But the Battle of Guadalcanal was still ahead. Just 2 weeks later, the Japanese command gathered the combined fleet to the north of the islands, preparing to strike back. Operation KA's first phase included finding and destroying U.S. aircraft carriers, while the airplanes that were launched from the light aircraft carrier Ryujo were bombing Henderson Field. Admiral Nagumo's main forces, which included Shokaku and Zuyaki carriers, were standing by and waiting for the information on the location of the U.S. fleet. On August 24, Nagumo received a message that cost 3 scout plane pilots their lives.
Stick to the plan. Break into 3 groups and attack the fleet from different directions to confuse the defense line.
While Maruyama's troops were fighting desperately on land, trying to take Henderson Field, the 4th battle between Japanese and U.S. carrier forces began several hundred miles to the northeast of the island. Mistakenly believing that Henderson Field had been taken, the Japanese fleet was approaching the islands in 3 separate groups to provide support to the ground forces.
American defense forces to stop furious resistance. Stay in close formation and get ready to defeat enemy attacks.
Głośno i wyraźnie. Przerywacie. Powtórzcie.
Hornet attacked by Orange carrier planes at 0911. Several bomb hits, 1 or more torpedo hits. Now dead in water and burning someone. Northampton preparing to take in tow.
The Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August the 8th. Japanese positions and the airfield were continuously attacked from the air from that moment. Both sides continued to send reinforcements to the island for months. As the scale of the battle continued to grow, it became obvious that the battle for Guadalcanal would forever turn the tide of the war. The campaign involved nearly all branches of the armed forces. Aircraft carriers and other warships exchanged blows. Warplanes from both sides engaged in hour-long dogfights. Infantry fought desperate battles in the disease-ridden jungle. Even a few tanks managed to traverse the virtually impenetrable terrain and join the fray. The Americans fought tooth and nail and eventually gained the upper hand, losing nearly 7,000 men in the campaign. Japanese losses numbered nearly 31,000. Two more carrier battles that took place during the Guadalcanal campaign further exacerbated the Japanese situation. More experienced Navy pilots were irreplaceably lost. A year after Pearl Harbor, less than half of the December 7th veterans were still alive. They were being replaced with novices straight out of flight school. In a single year, Japan experienced an incredible mix of triumph and failure. Carrier-based war, started by Japan, was lost no sooner than it had begun. Even before Pearl Harbor, the US government ordered 6 new Essex-class aircraft carriers. In contrast, the Japanese had only 1 new carrier in the works. They had nothing with which to replace their losses. However, by March 1st, 1943, Japan still occupied vast territories. The Japanese Army and Navy were working on new plans to reverse the course of the war in the Pacific. The war was not over yet.